Warren Embry built his career on one promise. He never sent an innocent man to prison. My brother Russ has been sitting in a cell at Brushy Mountain for 19 years. My name's Boyd Hensley. I'm 36. I'm an electrician in Irwin, Tennessee. And the fire that killed Gus Ormond, the one they said my brother set, was ruled arson based on science that the entire field has since thrown in the trash. My brother was convicted on burn marks that didn't mean what they said they meant. And last March, I sat in a room in Nashville and watched Warren Embry, the DA who put Russ away, sit at a folding table in front of 9 review board members while his own case collapsed around him. His hands didn't move from his lap for 40 minutes. When it was over, his fingers were shaking so badly his attorney had to carry his files. Now, before I take you through all of this, if you're the kind of person who stays for the whole story, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because what Warren Embry did after my brother's trial, the thing he buried for 19 years, is something I didn't uncover until 8 months into my own investigation. And it changes everything. Drop a comment right now. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know who's riding this one out with me. Let me take you back to the summer of 2005, because that's where this starts. That's where it all went wrong. I grew up on the south end of Irwin, Unicoi County, the kind of place where your neighbor knows when you got home last night and whether you were alone. I loved it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. Friday nights at the high school football field, Sunday mornings at Limestone Cove Baptist, that diner on Main, Faze, where everybody ate breakfast and nobody was in a hurry. The mountains around town turned gold every October, and people would drive up from Knoxville just to look at them. I never understood that. They were just the mountains to me. They were home. Russ was 7 years older than me. He worked construction, mostly framing houses and doing finish carpentry up in Johnson City. He was good at it. People requested him by name. He didn't say much on the job. He'd show up, do the work, and the homeowner would call the contractor the next week saying they'd never had cabinets hung that straight. That was Russ. He'd rather build you something than talk about it. Gus Ormond ran the hardware store on Railroad Avenue for close to 40 years. Everybody in town bought from Gus. He knew your name, he knew your project, and he'd tell you when you were buying the wrong size bolt. He kept a jar of root beer barrels on the counter for kids. Every child in Irwin grew up reaching into that jar. He was 71 when he died. The night of August 9th, 2005, somebody called in a fire at Ormond's Hardware around 11:40 p.m. By the time the volunteer crew got there, the back half of the building was fully involved. They found Gus inside. He'd been working late, something about inventory for a delivery the next day. He never made it out. Russ had been at the store earlier that evening. Around 8 p.m., he'd gone in for roofing nails. 3 people saw his truck in the lot. Within 48 hours, he was the only person the sheriff's office was looking at. Now I need to be honest about something. When they arrested Russ, I was 17, and I didn't know what to think. I mean, my brother? Russ, who built my mom a bookshelf for her birthday every single year because he couldn't afford to buy her anything nice? It didn't make sense. But the investigators stood in front of cameras and said they had physical evidence. Pour patterns, accelerant traces, a fire that could not have started on its own. And the DA, Warren Embry, he was the one who stood at that podium and said, "The evidence speaks for itself." I remember watching that on the local news. I was sitting on the floor in our living room, still wearing my work boots from a landscaping job I'd had that summer. The carpet smelled like dog and laundry detergent. My mom was behind me on the couch and she didn't make a sound. Not one sound. I turned around and she was just sitting there with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the screen like she was watching something very far away. The trial was fast. 4 days. January 2006. The courtroom was on the second floor of the county courthouse. Fluorescent lights, wood paneling that hadn't been refinished since the 80s, and a heating system that rattled every 10 minutes like someone was kicking the wall. I sat in the back row in a borrowed button-down that was too big in the shoulders. The fire investigator, a guy named Dale Suttles from the state fire marshal's office, testified for 2 hours. He had photographs. He had diagrams. He pointed at V patterns on the walls and said they proved the fire had multiple points of origin. He pointed at dark, uneven marks on the concrete floor and said those were classic indicators of a liquid accelerant being poured. He used the word undeniable. Russ's public defender, I'm not going to name him because he tried, he really did. He brought in a general contractor who said the building's wiring was old and dangerous. But Warren Embry stood up on cross-examination and said, "Are you a fire scientist?" The contractor said no. Embry said, "Then respectfully, sir, your opinion on what caused this fire carries the weight of a guess." The jury was out for 6 hours. Guilty. First-degree arson resulting in death. 23 years. That's what Russ got. After the verdict, Embry did a press conference on the courthouse steps. Calm. Measured. He looked into the camera and said, "Russell Hensley is just another case of someone who thought the rules didn't apply to them. This community is safer tonight." Just like that. Like my brother was a category, not a person. My mother never recovered. I don't mean that the way people usually mean it. I mean, she stopped going places, stopped answering the phone. She'd sit on the back porch in the evenings and stare at the ridgeline, and if you asked her what she was thinking, she'd say, "Nothing." By 2011, she was living alone in the house on Elm Street, and I was the only person she let inside. She died in 2018. Pancreatic cancer. She was 67. The last thing she said to me that made sense was, "Don't let them forget he's in there." For 16 years, I believed them. I trusted the system. I thought, they tested the evidence, they presented it in court, 12 people agreed. I visited Russ every month. I sent him money for commissary, and I tried to build a life. And then one afternoon on Route 81, I heard something that made me pull over and sit in a gas station parking lot until my hands stopped shaking. I got my electrician's license at 22, started doing residential work around Unicoi and Washington counties. By 30, I had my own van, a small crew of 2 guys, and enough referrals to keep busy year-round. I married in 2012. We split in 2016. That's not part of this story, but I'm telling you so you understand where I was at. 33 years old, living alone in a rented house in Irwin, running my business, visiting my brother once a month at Brushy Mountain. That was my life. Then in September 2022, I was driving back from a job in Jonesboro. It was maybe a 40-minute drive. I had a podcast on, one of those true crime shows, I don't even remember which one, and they were interviewing a fire scientist. And he was explaining how poor pattern analysis, the thing Dale Suttles used to convict my brother, had been discredited by the scientific community over a decade ago. I took my foot off the gas. The truck drifted to the shoulder and I just sat there with the engine idling, the podcast still playing through the speakers, the guy still talking about fire behavior and flashover dynamics, and I couldn't process a single word because my ears were ringing. My hands were locked on the steering wheel. I could feel my own pulse in my palms. He said, and I'm paraphrasing here, that the burn patterns investigators used to identify arson in the 1990s and 2000s were the result of natural fire behavior, flashover, ventilation patterns, the way a fire breathes in a room full of combustible material. He said buildings burn in ways that look intentional but aren't, and that dozens of people had been convicted based on fire science that was no better than reading tea leaves. I pulled into a gas station parking lot and sat there for probably 20 minutes. The podcast ended and another one started, something about a cold case in Oregon, and I didn't turn it off. I didn't move, because if that was true, if the science was wrong, then my brother had been in prison for 17 years for a fire that might have started in a wall, an electrical fire, in a 70-year-old building with original wiring. I know wiring. That's what I do. And I remembered something. The general contractor at Russ's trial, the one Warren Embry shut down on the stand, he'd said the building had knob and tube wiring from the 1950s, no ground fault protection, no updated panels, and Gus had been running power tools, heat lamps, and industrial fans off that system for decades. I called Russ that night. The first thing he said was, "Don't." Just the one word, flat, like a door closing. He told me he'd tried to get the conviction appealed in 2009, and the court denied it. He said he was done. I told him I wasn't. So here's where I need to explain something about how this went. Because I didn't just wake up and start investigating. It took months. Months of reading, calling people, hitting dead ends, and wondering if I was wasting what was left of my life chasing something that wouldn't go anywhere. The first thing I did was request a copy of the trial transcript. That took 6 weeks. I got it in November 2022, a box of photocopied pages, maybe 400 sheets. I sat at my kitchen table and read every word. It took me 3 nights. And somewhere in the middle of that stack, I found something. During the trial, Russ's public defender filed a motion to introduce testimony from a second fire expert, a Dr. Loretta Moss, a fire dynamics researcher at the University of Maryland. The motion was denied. The judge agreed with the prosecution that Dr. Moss hadn't personally inspected the scene and that her testimony would be speculative and prejudicial. I almost skipped past it. These motions get denied all the time. Every trial has procedural rulings, and at that point, I thought this was just another one, a judge making a judgment call. But what caught my eye was the filing itself. The defense motion included a 2-page summary of what Dr. Moss would have testified, and it said, in writing, in the court record, that the burn patterns at Orman's Hardware were consistent with post-flashover fire behavior and not reliably indicative of incendiary origin. I read that paragraph 3 times. She was saying the same thing the podcast expert said in 2005, before the trial even happened. Now, at that point, I didn't know what to do with it. I wasn't a lawyer. I wasn't an investigator. I was an electrician with a box of transcripts on his kitchen table. But I started making calls. I found a wrongful conviction advocacy group out of Knoxville, the Appalachian Innocence Project. I talked to a woman there who told me that fire science challenges were one of the most common grounds for post-conviction review in Tennessee. She said if I could get the physical evidence re-examined by a qualified fire scientist and the findings contradicted the original testimony, there was a path. A path. That's what she said. Not a guarantee. A path. I want to stop here for a second, because I know some of you watching this have been in a situation where you uncovered something that made you question everything. A diagnosis, a legal ruling, something you were told was settled. And you had that moment where you thought, do I pull this thread or do I leave it alone? Tell me in the comments. What did you do? Because the first thing I found almost sent me in the completely wrong direction. But then I thought about Russ, sitting in that cell, 19 years. I picked up the phone. The first false trail almost broke me. I spent 2 months looking into Gus Orman's business partner. They'd co-owned the property the hardware store sat on, a deal they'd made back in 1987. By 2005, the partner wanted to sell. Gus didn't. There was a $340,000 insurance policy on the building and contents, and the partner had filed for bankruptcy protection in February of 2005, 6 months before the fire. I thought I had it. I thought this was the answer. A man with financial motive, access to the building, and every reason to want that fire. I drove to the county clerk's office 3 separate times pulling records. I sat in my truck making timelines on the back of an envelope. The math worked. The motive was clean. I could see the whole thing laid out like a wiring diagram. This man burned that building for the insurance money, and my brother took the fall. Turns out the insurance policy had lapsed. The partner let it expire in June 2005, 2 months before the fire. He'd stopped paying premiums as part of his bankruptcy filing. The building was uninsured on the night Gus died. There was nothing to collect. I confirmed it through the county clerk's office. The lapsed policy was in the bankruptcy records. Public document. I sat in the clerk's parking lot and stared at the dashboard. 2 months. 2 months of late nights, legal records, county filings, and the thing I was most sure of was wrong. I thought about calling Russ and telling him I'd failed. I thought about closing the box of transcripts and putting it in the garage and going back to pulling wire for the rest of my life. What it did, though, and I didn't realize this at the time, was make me stop looking for someone to blame. Because the more I read about fire science, the more I understood that sometimes there isn't a villain in the fire itself. Sometimes a building just burns, and the villain is the person who insists someone lit it when the evidence doesn't support that conclusion. In March 2023, I made the call that changed everything. I contacted Dr. Reed Stanfield. He's a fire dynamics consultant based in Atlanta, PhD in combustion engineering from Georgia Tech. He's been retained as an expert in over 90 fire investigation cases across the Southeast, and he's been involved in 7 overturned arson convictions. I found his name through the Appalachian Innocence Project. I told him about Russ. I told him about the trial. I told him about Dale Suttles' testimony and the pour pattern evidence. And I told him about Dr. Loretta Moss, the expert the judge wouldn't let testify. He was still for a long time. Then he said, "Send me everything you have." I sent him the trial transcript, the fire investigation report, the original photographs, and the building permits I'd pulled from Unicoi County records showing the wiring history. I sealed the envelope and stood there at the counter holding it. 13 pounds of my brother's life. If this man said what Dale Suttles said, if the science held, then I was done. But if it didn't, while I waited for Dr. Stanfield, I kept digging. And that's when I met someone who would change the entire direction of this case. Her name was Nadine Pruitt. She'd been the court stenographer for Russ's trial in 2006. Retired now, living outside Jonesboro. I found her through the county court records office. Her name was on every transcript page. I drove to her house on a Thursday afternoon in April 2023. She lived in a small brick ranch with a flagstone walkway and a screen porch full of ferns. The porch ceiling was painted haint blue, that old mountain tradition to keep spirits away. She knew who I was the second I said my name. She said, "I remember your brother's trial." She said it the way a person says something they've been carrying, careful, like she'd rehearsed it without meaning to. Now, Nadine wasn't involved in the case. She didn't investigate anything. She didn't take sides. She typed what people said in court. That was her job for 31 years. But she told me something that afternoon that I still think about every day. She said, "I've sat through over 400 trials in this county, and I can tell you that the Hensley trial was the only one where I went home and couldn't sleep." I asked her why. She set her iced tea down on the porch railing, carefully, the way someone does when they're buying time, and looked at me for a long time. She said, "Because I typed every word Dr. Moss was going to say. It was in the defense motion, and then the judge ruled it inadmissible, and nobody in that courtroom ever heard it. But I did. I typed it, and I knew what it meant." I asked her if she'd kept anything. She paused, looked at me over the top of her glasses. She said she had copies of every transcript she'd ever produced, personal archives, boxes in her basement. She said it was standard practice for her. My insurance policy, she called it. But then she said, "I haven't been down there in years. I don't even know if the Hensley files are still there. Those boxes got moved twice during the renovation." We went downstairs together. It took almost 40 minutes. She had me pulling boxes off shelves while she read labels through her bifocals. 3rd box was wrong. 5th box had the right year but only civil cases. She started second-guessing herself. Maybe I only kept the sentencings, not the full files. And then, in a banker's box behind a broken dehumidifier, she found a manila folder with a court case number written on the tab in her own handwriting. She held it against her chest for a moment before she opened it. 19 years she'd had this in her basement. I think she understood, standing there in that low-ceilinged room with the light buzzing overhead, that handing it to me meant she was no longer someone who just typed what people said in court. Inside was the full defense motion, not just the 2-page summary I'd read, but the complete filing, including Dr. Moss's 4-page preliminary analysis and a cover letter from Russ's public defender to the DA's office dated November 2005. That cover letter was addressed to Warren Embry personally. It said, and I'm going to be careful here because this matters, it said that Dr. Moss had reviewed the fire investigation photographs and found the analysis fundamentally inconsistent with accepted fire dynamics principles. Warren Embry received that letter 2 months before the trial. He read it. He knew another expert was contradicting his case, and he fought to keep her out of the courtroom. This wasn't a routine legal ruling. This wasn't a judge exercising discretion. This was a prosecutor who saw evidence that his case was built on bad science and chose to bury it. I need to ask you something. If you found out that the person who put your family member in prison had seen evidence that might have freed them and buried it, what would you do? Would you keep going, Or would you walk away? I'm not being dramatic. I'm asking because I almost stopped right here. Tell me what you'd think. I really want to know. Because what Embry did next to try to shut me down, that's coming, and it's worse than you think. 6 months. That's how long I sat with what I knew and didn't do a damn thing about it. I know how that sounds. But you have to understand, I was scared. Not of Warren Embry specifically. Scared of what it meant if I was right. Scared that I'd take this public and nobody would care. Scared that I'd burn down my business, my reputation, my entire life in Irwin, and Russ would still be sitting in that cell. I used to lie in bed at night and picture what I wanted. Russ standing in a workshop somewhere, running his hand along a piece of oak, building something. Cabinets, a table, anything. Just his hands on wood again, working. That's what I was fighting for. And the thought that I could lose, that I could go through all of this and fail, made my chest tight at 3 in the morning. There was a night in July, maybe August, when I drove past the county courthouse at 10 p.m. Every window was dark except one on the second floor, Embry's office. I pulled over across the street and sat there with my lights off for 15 minutes, watching that window, knowing that somewhere in that building was the letter that proved what he'd done. I put my truck in gear and drove home. I didn't sleep that night. And Warren Embry, I need to tell you what he was doing during this time because it's important. In June 2023, Warren Embry announced his candidacy for Circuit Court Judge. After 31 years as DA, he was going to cap his career on the bench. The local paper, the Irwin Record, ran a front-page piece about his record. 63 felony convictions without a single reversal on appeal. They called him Unicoi County's unbreakable standard. 63 convictions. Russ was number 27. And I remember reading that article at the counter of Faye's Diner on a Tuesday morning, and the waitress, a woman I'd known since high school, she saw me looking at it and said, "That's a good man right there. Irwin's lucky to have him." I didn't say anything. I just folded the paper and finished my eggs. But here's the thing about being an electrician in a small town. People talk to you. You're in their houses, you're in their businesses, you're in their churches and schools running conduit through crawl spaces. And nobody watches what they say around the guy pulling wire above the ceiling tiles. You hear things. And what I started hearing, once I started listening, was that not everybody in Irwin thought Warren Embry walked on water. There were people who remembered the Hensley trial. There were people who thought Russ got railroaded. They just didn't say it where Embry's office could hear them. In October 2023, Dr. Stanfield sent me his preliminary findings, 7 months after I'd mailed him the evidence package. And his conclusion, I'm going to read you the exact language because the words matter. His conclusion was that the indicators cited in the original fire investigation, including alleged pour patterns and multiple points of origin, are fully consistent with natural post-flashover fire behavior and do not constitute reliable evidence of an incendiary cause. He wasn't done. He said the building's electrical system, the knob and tube wiring, the absence of GFCI protection, the overloaded circuits documented in Gus Ormond's own insurance inspection from 2001, represented a high-probability accidental ignition source that was not adequately investigated or ruled out. I read that report sitting in my truck outside a job site in Limestone. I read it twice. Then I called Russ. He didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. Then he said, "Boyd, you sure about this guy?" Short, wary, like a man who'd stopped letting himself want things. I said, "I'm sure." And I heard something through that phone I hadn't heard from my brother in almost 20 years. He was crying. Now, you need to hear this part. Like and subscribe right now, because what Warren Embry did when he found out I was asking questions, you are not ready for it. I don't know exactly how Embry found out. Small town. Could have been anyone. But the week before the trouble started, the Appalachian Innocence Project called me. The woman I'd been working with said Dr. Stanfield's preliminary findings were exactly the kind of evidence that moves cases. She said they wanted to take Russ's case formally. She said she'd seen a lot of wrongful conviction petitions cross her desk, and this one had teeth. I hung up the phone and stood in my kitchen with my hand still on the receiver, and I thought, this is going to work. For the first time in 17 months, I actually believed it. 3 days later, everything started falling apart. In December 2023, I got a call from Hal Whitson, who owns Whitson Contracting, my biggest client. Hal and I had been working together for 6 years. I'd wired maybe 40 houses for him. He said he needed to meet for coffee. We sat at a booth at Faye's. The irony of that place, I swear. And Hal looked uncomfortable. He said, "Boyd, I got a call from the DA's office last week. He said someone in Embry's office told him I was involved in reopening old cases and that it was creating a distraction that could affect county business relationships." Hal didn't say it directly. He's not that kind of man. But the message was clear. If he kept working with me, there could be problems. I lost 3 contracts in January 2024. Whitson pulled 2 projects. Another contractor, a guy I'd done 1 phone call with, never met face-to-face, left a voicemail saying his legal counsel had advised him to go in a different direction. I played that voicemail twice. His voice was tight, rehearsed, like he was reading from a card. I'd already bought $4,100 in materials for that job. Non-refundable. They're still stacked in my garage. 30 boxes of 12-gauge Romex and 2 panel boxes I can't return and can't use. Then in February, I got a letter from the Unicoi County Clerk's office. My request to access the original fire investigation evidence, the physical samples from Orman's hardware that were stored in the county evidence warehouse, had been denied. The letter said the materials were under active preservation protocol and not available for third-party examination. Active preservation protocol. For a 19-year-old closed case that nobody had touched since 2006. I went to the clerk's office. The woman at the counter, she wouldn't look at me. She said the denial came from the DA's office. I said, "The DA doesn't have authority over evidence access for closed cases." She said, "You'll need to talk to the DA about that." And that's when I ran into Warren Embry himself. Not by accident. He was walking out of the clerk's office as I was walking in. He stopped in the hallway. Gray suit, blue tie, silver cufflinks. He was maybe 63 then. Tall. The kind of face that looks like it was designed for a campaign poster. He looked at me and said, "Boyd." Just my name. Like we were friends. I said, "I want access to the evidence from my brother's case." He put his hands in his pockets and said, "You know, I've seen this before. Family members who can't accept a verdict. It's painful, and I have sympathy for it. But what you're doing, this crusade, it's not going to change the outcome. All it's going to do is hurt you. And frankly, it's already starting to." I said, "Then why are you blocking my evidence request?" He smiled. Not a mean smile, worse, a patient smile. The kind you give a child who doesn't understand something obvious. He said, "I'm not blocking anything. I'm protecting the integrity of a conviction that a jury of 12 citizens, your neighbors, rendered based on clear physical evidence. If you want to hire some out-of-state expert to write a report for money, that's your right. But this office has a responsibility to this community that goes beyond one family's grief." One family's grief. That's how he described 19 years of my brother's life. I felt the heat rise from my chest into my jaw. My fists tightened in my jacket pockets, and I could feel the seams of the lining strain against my knuckles. I wanted to say something that would take that patient smile off his face. I wanted to tell him about the letter in Nadine's basement, about Dr. Stanfield's findings, about the fact that his entire career was built on science that a first-year chemistry student could debunk. But I didn't. Not yet. I walked out. I sat in my truck in the parking lot for probably 15 minutes, and I decided 2 things. 1, I wasn't stopping. 2, Warren Embry was never going to see me coming. But that night, and I need to tell you this, my ex-wife left a voicemail. She said she'd heard from someone in town what was happening. She said, "I just want you to know I think what you're doing is right, and I'm sorry about the contracts." She didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. I played it twice, and then I sat on the porch and watched the dark come down over the mountains. And it was the first time in weeks I didn't feel completely alone. Would you have kept going? After losing your biggest client, after getting cut out of jobs you'd already bought materials for, after having a district attorney tell you to your face that your brother's life was just one family's grief, would you have kept going? Or would you have cut your losses? Tell me in the comments. Because what I did next, I went silent, completely dark. And what that silence was hiding is something Warren Embry didn't figure out until it was too late. Now I need to tell you about the next 7 months, because this is where the story you think you're hearing becomes something different. The economic retaliation and the silence happened at the same time. While I was losing contracts and watching my income cut in half, I was also waiting for Dr. Stanfield's final report and working with the Innocence Project on the formal petition. I was enduring and preparing simultaneously, and Embry only saw the enduring. See, after that hallway conversation, I went dark. I went silent. Radio silence. I stopped filing records requests. I stopped asking questions around town. I stopped talking about Russ's case to anyone except Dr. Stanfield and the Appalachian Innocence Project. As far as Irwin was concerned, Boyd Hensley had given up. That was the plan. In March 2024, Dr. Stanfield completed his final report, 43 pages. He identified 9 specific indicators from the original fire investigation that were scientifically invalid under current NFPA 921 standards, the National Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigations. He documented the building's electrical history. He reconstructed the fire's probable path using computational fire modeling, and his conclusion was unambiguous. The fire at Orman's Hardware was, within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty, accidental in origin. I held that report in my hands, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt sick, because if this was right, and I believed it was, my brother had lost 19 years of his life for a fire that started in a wall. The Appalachian Innocence Project filed a petition for post-conviction review with the Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility in April 2024. They cited 3 grounds: unreliable scientific evidence, newly discovered evidence in the form of Dr. Stanfield's analysis, and suppression of exculpatory information, meaning the Loretta Moss letter that Warren Embry had received and fought to exclude. The filing was made on a Monday. By Wednesday, it had been forwarded to the Tennessee Attorney General's office for independent review. That meant it was out of Unicoi County's hands. Warren Embry couldn't block it, suppress it, or make it disappear, but he didn't know that yet. I called Russ the night the petition was filed. I told him it was done, officially in the system, out of Embry's reach. He was still for a long time. Then he said, "Boyd, what's the weather been like?" I said, "What?" He said, "Out there. What's spring look like this year?" I told him the dogwoods were blooming early, that the creek behind my house was running high from the rain. He said, "Yeah." And then, very quietly, "I miss rain." There's this line I wrote down in a notebook during that time. I was sitting on my back porch looking at the mountains, and it just came to me. The people who bury the truth always forget. The ground shifts. Because that's what was happening. The ground under Warren Embry's career was shifting, and he was too busy planning his judicial campaign to feel it. In June 2024, Embry held a fundraiser at the Irwin Community Center, Campaign for Circuit Court Judge. I heard about it from 3 different people, 200 attendees, local business owners, county officials, church leaders. They put his picture on a banner behind the podium. While he was shaking hands and collecting checks, the Tennessee Attorney General's office was reviewing 19 years of his casework, and they were starting with case number 27, and the law was about to move. My hands were cold. That's the first thing I remember about September 19th. I was standing outside the Andrew Jackson building in Nashville at 8 in the morning, and my hands were cold, even though it was 72 degrees. The Tennessee Board of Professional Responsibility convened a formal review hearing in a conference room on the 4th floor. Long room, low ceiling, fluorescent tubes that hummed at a frequency you could feel in your molars. Folding tables arranged in a horseshoe. 9 board members. A state-appointed hearing officer. 2 representatives from the Attorney General's office, Dr. Reed Stanfield. A lawyer from the Appalachian Innocence Project named Theo Cates. Nadine Pruitt, who'd driven 3 hours to be there with her original transcript copies in a leather briefcase. And Warren Embry. Sitting at a table with his attorney. I was in the 2nd row. I wore the same button-down shirt I'd worn to Russ's trial in 2006. Not on purpose, it was the nicest shirt I owned. Embry saw me when he walked in. He didn't say anything. He sat down and opened a folder and started reading something. His face was calm, composed, like this was any other legal proceeding. The hearing officer opened by reading the petition into the record. Then Theo Cates presented the case. He was methodical. He walked the board through the original trial testimony, the fire investigation report, the photographs. He explained what poor pattern analysis was and why it had been discredited by the scientific community. Halfway through his presentation, a door in the back of the room opened and someone walked in late, a clerk or an aide, and the noise made Embry flinch, just barely. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Then Dr. Stanfield testified. He stood at a screen with enlarged photographs of the Ormond fire scene, and, piece by piece, calmly, precisely, with no dramatics, he dismantled every single conclusion Dale Suttles had presented in 2006. The V-patterns on the walls? Natural ventilation-driven fire behavior. The floor markings? Melted inventory residue, paint cans, adhesive, solvent containers that Gus stored on floor-level shelves. The multiple points of origin? A single fire spreading through a combustible environment with no fire barriers between sections. 9 indicators, all 9 wrong. A board member near the end of the table, a woman with reading glasses pushed up on her head, stopped writing and set her pen down. She looked at Embry. He didn't look back. But the thing that cracked the room, the thing I will never forget, was when Theo Cates stood up and asked for Exhibit 14 to be entered into the record. Exhibit 14 was the cover letter from Russ's public defender to Warren Embry's office, dated November 9, 2005. The one Nadine had kept in her basement for 19 years. The one that said, in Dr. Loretta Moss's own words, that the fire science in this case was fundamentally inconsistent with accepted fire dynamics principles. Embry's attorney stood up. Objection. This document was part of a pre-trial motion that was ruled on by the presiding judge. It's already been adjudicated. Introducing it here is prejudicial and procedurally improper. The room went still. I felt the back of my neck go cold, because I'd seen this before. I'd read about it in the transcript. This was exactly what happened in 2006. Someone tried to introduce Dr. Moss's analysis, and a legal objection shut it down. I gripped the edge of my chair and I thought, not again. Not again. The hearing officer looked at the objection for what felt like a full minute. Then she said, "Overruled. This is a review proceeding, not a trial. The document is admitted." Theo read the letter aloud. The room was silent. Then he said, "Mr. Embry received this letter 2 months before trial. He filed a motion to exclude Dr. Moss's testimony. The court granted that motion. And for 19 years, this letter sat in a filing cabinet while Russell Hensley sat in a cell." I looked at Embry. He was staring at the table. His attorney was writing something on a legal pad. And for the first time in my life, I saw Warren Embry's hands shake. The hearing officer asked Embry if he wanted to respond. Embry stood up. He buttoned his jacket. And he said, word for word, "I'll remember this until I die." He said, "This office made a determination based on the evidence available at the time. Fire science evolves. That doesn't make a conviction wrongful." Dr. Stanfield leaned into his microphone and said, "With respect, counselor, the science didn't evolve between November 2005 and January 2006. Dr. Moss told you the same thing then. You chose not to listen." The board member with the reading glasses leaned forward. 2 others shifted in their chairs. Someone near me exhaled like they'd been holding their breath. And I sat there watching a man who'd spent 31 years behind a podium hear the one sentence that podium couldn't protect him from. The hearing lasted 4 hours and 12 minutes. The board's preliminary finding, issued on the record before we left the room, was that the original conviction was materially compromised by unreliable scientific testimony and the suppression of exculpatory expert analysis. They recommended immediate review by the Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals for possible vacature of the conviction. Warren Embry left the room without looking at anyone. His attorney had to hold the door for him because his hands were full of files he hadn't opened. I stayed in my chair for a long time after everybody left. The projector was still on, showing the last slide, A photograph of the floor of Orman's Hardware. The fluorescent lights buzzed the same way they had for 4 hours and 12 minutes. The room smelled like old carpet and coffee. And sitting there in that emptying room, I didn't feel vindication. I felt the full weight of 19 years pressed down on my chest like a hand. My brother was 24 when he went in. My mother died waiting. She never got to sit in this room. She never got to hear Dr. Stanfield say what she'd known in her gut since 2006. Victory to grief in one breath. That's what it felt like. I won the hearing and lost my mother all over again in the same silence. The aftermath came fast. October 2024, the Court of Criminal Appeals issued an order vacating Russ's conviction pending a new evidentiary hearing. He wasn't free yet, but the clock was running in our direction for the first time in 19 years. I sat in my truck in the driveway when I got that call, and I pressed my forehead against the steering wheel and didn't move for 10 minutes. Not crying, not celebrating, just breathing, letting it be real. November 6, 2024. Warren Embry withdrew from the judicial race. His campaign released a 2-sentence statement. After careful reflection, I have decided to focus on my current duties and will not be seeking the circuit court bench at this time. That was it. No mention of the review board. No mention of Russ. No mention of the letter he'd buried. After careful reflection, I laughed when I read that. Out loud, standing in my kitchen. After careful reflection. Like it was a lifestyle choice. Like the man had taken a long walk in the woods and decided he'd rather garden. Not like 9 board members had just told him his biggest case was built on junk science and suppressed evidence. Careful reflection. That's a hell of a way to spell caught. November 14th. The Tennessee Attorney General's office opened an independent investigation into Warren Embry's handling of the Hensley case, specifically the suppression of the Moss analysis. This wasn't the review board anymore. This was a formal misconduct inquiry. December 2024. Dale Suttles, the original fire investigator, was contacted by the AG's office. I found out later, not from him, from public records, that Suttles had already recanted similar testimony in a Virginia case in 2018, 6 years before my petition. He'd told a Virginia court that he now understood poor pattern analysis was unreliable. He'd used that same unreliable analysis to testify against my brother, and he'd never come back to Tennessee to say, "I was wrong about the Hensley case." He just moved on to the next state and changed his story there. January 8, 2025. I got a phone call from Theo Cates at 7:43 in the morning. I was in my truck, about to start a job. He said the Court of Criminal Appeals had granted Russ's motion. Conviction vacated. Immediate release. I pulled over. I sat on the shoulder of the road, and I could feel every month of those 2 years in my shoulders. Every call, every dead end, every night on the porch staring at the mountains wondering if I was losing my mind. It collapsed into one moment on the side of a road in Irwin, Tennessee at 7:43 in the morning. I drove straight to Brushy Mountain. 3 hours, 12 minutes. I didn't stop once. Russ walked out at 2:16 p.m. on January 8, 2025. He was wearing a gray t-shirt and khaki pants the facility gave him. He was 43 years old. He'd gone in at 24. He stood on the sidewalk outside the gate and looked up at the sky for a long time. I was standing maybe 10 feet away. I didn't know what to say. I mean, what do you say? Sorry I took 19 years? He looked at me and said, "Boyd." Just my name. Like that was enough. And it was. We drove back to Irwin. He didn't talk much. He looked out the window at the mountains, and once or twice he said something like, "They widened this road," or, "That gas station used to be a farm stand." Small things. 19 years of small changes that added up to a world he didn't recognize. At one point, he rolled the window down and held his hand out in the wind like a kid on a road trip. He didn't explain it. He didn't need to. 3 months after Russ came home, a woman I didn't know stopped me outside the post office. She said, "I just want you to know, a lot of us knew something was wrong with that trial. We just didn't know how to say it." I looked at her and I said, "You could have said it any time." She didn't have an answer for that. Warren Embry resigned as district attorney on March 4, 2025. The formal misconduct findings haven't been released yet, but the investigation is ongoing. His law license is under suspension pending the outcome. The man who stood in front of cameras and said, "The evidence speaks for itself," is now hiring a defense attorney. The last time I saw him was at the county courthouse 2 weeks ago. He was waiting in the lobby, not behind a desk, not at a podium, just sitting in a plastic chair by the window, holding a folder, waiting for his name to be called. I walked past him. He looked up. I didn't stop. He's living with me now, Russ, in the spare bedroom. It's small, a twin bed, a dresser, a window that looks out at the tree line. He gets up every morning at 5:30, which I think is a habit from the facility, and he makes coffee. He's been doing some carpentry work for a guy in Limestone, small jobs, getting his hands back. Look, if you stayed this whole time, through Russ's trial, through Warren Embry's hallway, through those 7 months when I thought I might be losing my mind, thank you. That's not a small thing. This story took me 2 years to live, and it still takes something out of me every time I think about it. If it meant something to you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you're not already. There are more stories here, and every one of them matters to somebody the way this one matters to me. And leave a comment. I want to know, have you ever trusted a system completely and then found out it failed someone you loved? Because that's the thing nobody tells you. The system doesn't apologize. It just moves on. And you're the one left standing in the parking lot trying to figure out how to start over. If you've been there, I want to hear about it. Check out the next video, it's right here, because these stories need to be told. Every single one. Russ and I went fishing last Saturday. First time in 20 years. He didn't catch anything. Neither did I. We sat on the bank of the Nolichucky River and didn't talk about the case. The water moved over the rocks the same way it always had. Steady, unhurried, not caring who was listening. He said the water sounded the same. I said, yeah, it did.